This is Times Radio.
Now, we know that there are a lot of questions about what's happening in Ukraine and what it means for us here in the UK. So I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Max Tucker, who's a former Ukraine correspondent at The Times, who is going to answer questions that have been submitted by Times subscribers. If you want to, you can watch along. You can just go to the Times website or the Times Radio YouTube channel. And the Times have been asking subscribers for questions. We've got absolutely loads, dozens and dozens and dozens. So I'm going to try and get through as many of those as I can. But first off, while I'm pulling them out, Max, can you tell us a little bit about when you were in Ukraine, where you were living, kind of what you were doing, and give us a sense of just the country before this conflict kicked off?
Right, so I was based in Ukraine. Actually, the first time I went to Ukraine is 2011 when I was working for Amnesty International. And then I worked as a foreign correspondent for The Times between the end of 2014 to right up to the end of 2016. So I was covering the conflict in some of its most active stages when Russia was pushing through to try and capture Debaltseve and secure the Donetsk and Luhansk regions when the war was quite isolated. But at the same time, I was based in Kiev. I was going backwards and forwards to the front lines. And you could see how the city was changing over that period of time, over the last decade, really, going from cafes and restaurants that didn't have Wi-Fi to this kind of thriving metropolis that people now want to visit from all over Europe. And it's just absolutely tragic to see it under heavy shell fire, and the people and the cafes are just closed down and supermarkets empty. And all of the friends that I made there have left the country and are now homeless. And
if we go to some of the questions here, there's quite a lot of them that are talking directly about war. I know you're not a war correspondent, you're a foreign correspondent, but we'll try and get to them. But just before we get there, in terms of, like you say, you trying to get in touch with, keep in touch with your friends from that time, have they all taken the same route out? Have they gone to different places?
A lot of people have gone to very different places, and some people have just chosen to go to Moldova. Friends from Odessa, perhaps it's easiest to get into Moldova, and then through to Romania. And most people want to end up in the EU, and countries like Moldova just can't handle the surge of refugees. Others have decided they'll just go to Western Ukraine and stay up in Lviv. So a lot of my friends in Kiev, mostly journalists who want to stay and continue working, are now based in Lviv in Western Ukraine. My wife's grandparents are still in Kiev, sadly, so we're worried about them and their future. But some people, particularly the elderly, have just chosen to stay in their houses because they don't see where else they can go and what the future holds.
Well, here's a diplomatic question. It's come from Matthew Box. Thank you, Matthew, for writing in. He says, lots of people think that this could be a trigger for a much larger war involving the West. And what scenarios might that happen? And what scenarios might occur that could drag the West into a war?
I mean, the West has been very clear that it's not going to involve militarily in Ukraine, and it's not prepared to send kind of tanks and troops into Ukraine to fight Putin. I think, the worrying thing is that Putin has said, apparently to Macron yesterday, that he's determined to capture the whole of Ukraine. So if Russian troops did decide that they were going to push west, they would be fighting right on the EU borders of 4 member states. And it's easy to see how fighting could spill over to the borders, and particularly countries that have a troubled history with Russia, like Poland, might decide that enough is enough.
There's one here from David Dorman, and he's commenting on the change that we've seen in recent days from these attempts to have convoys and strikes straight through the country to actually standing back and shelling from afar. And his question here is, what possible benefit can Putin gain from destroying Ukraine, or at least its cities and towns, if he wins this war and has to administer and possibly rebuild areas that he's just destroyed?
It's a really great question. It's one that's on all of our minds. I think that Putin didn't think that he would have to destroy Ukraine when he started this war. I think he thought that he would overwhelm the Ukrainian military quickly and march into the cities quickly. But, in typical gangster mentality, he's now faced with resistance, and he just can't back down, and he will do whatever it takes to make Ukraine bend to his will.
Well, one here from Daniel, who has also put in his age, 25. Hi, Daniel. He's from Stoke-on-Trent. He says, Zelensky and Ukraine seem to be fighting well for now, but the Russian army is far larger, far better equipped than its Ukrainian counterpart. Is there any conceivable way that Ukraine doesn't lose the war?
Well, there's been a big question mark about how well trained the Russian military is. Obviously, it has superior technical abilities, but they've, some of the logistics that they've really got wrong. They've got this huge convoy stuck in north of Kyiv. It's stuck in the mud, held up by Ukrainian resistance. And there's seems to be a serious morale problem amongst the Russian troops as well. It's difficult to see now that Russia's switched to this game plan of just shelling and destroying using superior artillery to flatten cities. It's difficult to see Ukraine holding out for very long. But I think the hope is that Ukraine can hold out long enough for Western sanctions to have an effect that might consider Putin or the oligarchs that back him to pull back.
And sorry, this isn't from a reader. This is just me asking you this to expand a little bit on that. When you say to give these sanctions time to bite and to work, that essentially means creating unrest against the Kremlin's action in Russia, doesn't it?
Right. This is talking about ordinary people feeling the pinch in their pockets. It's about oligarchs feeling that they're losing billions of pounds, being isolated. It's one thing being able to spend your money in Russia, but a lot of these people want to go on holiday to European countries. Is the elite going to say to Putin, actually, this is time to stop this? And is it too late? Is he just too powerful now for them to be able to do that?
Well, one of the things that you said just a moment ago about Putin's gangster mentality is a question that's been picked up here by Julia. She's written in to say, obviously, Putin will never admit that he's wrong. He'll never back down. Is there a way for the international community to give him a way out which doesn't dent his pride from where we are?
Now that blood's been shed, it's really difficult to see the way out. I mean, Putin has made clear that he doesn't see Ukraine as a country and he doesn't think it should exist as a sovereign state. And expecting Ukrainians to accept that is very difficult. They won't accept that. So I think, the way this ends is either with, sadly, Ukraine being destroyed or Putin in handcuffs or dead.
That's quite the three choices you've given us there. One here that's on a slightly different question and line of thought. Dice McCairn has written in and has said, how is food and petrol still available? Are logistics systems still operating? Now, I think that's not universal, is it? There are different parts of the country where there's a different picture. Right.
So I can say that in Kiev, it's very hard to get food and drink. People are travelling to many different stores to try and get bread and milk. Petrol's even harder to come by. A lot of my friends were struggling to get the petrol they needed to get out of the city. But the city is not completely encircled. So there is still the opportunity to get into and deliver supplies. But obviously those supply drivers are taking huge risks. There are not so many people that are willing to do that. But it was something that I was really struck by with the civilian drivers who would come into towns that were under heavy bombardment just to deliver bread and water to people. It's some real bravery seen by civilians as well.
Well, a sort of linked question to that comes from Charles, who said, how are the arms being supplied by Europe getting into the Ukraine and how are they being trained to use them? Because we've seen, obviously there was training and stuff that went on before, but we have seen since the conflict escalated, pledges of equipment. Are these pieces of equipment getting into people's hands and how?
Right. So NATO is not disclosing very much about how it's doing that, but it does appear to be that aid is either flown into Poland or one of the member states, the EU member states surrounding the country, and then it's brought in by land into Western Ukraine. NATO soldiers, including British soldiers, have been training Ukrainian soldiers since 2015. And the idea that if their training programs, that they would train people how to use the weapons, but also train them how to train others. So they're kind of training the trainers so that more people can use these weapons.
Well, here's a couple of questions that aren't strictly about Ukraine. They're about Russia. They're about Belarus. So that it might not be your area of expertise, but if you can enlighten us as best you can. Do we know what is happening to the Russian people that are protesting against the war? That's Nashi Monster, because there's been a number of people that have been arrested. And another question here from someone with no name that says, please just explain the role of Belarus in this, because I'm not getting it.
Two very different questions.
Very different questions.
So Russians are being arrested. There's been more than 8,000 Russians have been arrested, and many of them are going to face court hearings, and they will either find themselves being fined.
Are they kept on remand? Are they released, held overnight, let go? Or are they released, held, kept until a court date comes up a week later?
It's a mixture of both.
Right.
It kind of depends on who you are, I think, Himeni, and what your history of protest is.
I was about to say, are you a troublemaker or not a troublemaker? Yeah.
And, very worryingly, we've seen that Russia has now introduced this law which prevents people from even talking about the war. So it's a 15-year prison sentence if you talk about the law, and that obviously has a massively chilling effect, not only on ordinary civilians, but also all the journalists independent journalists that have been trying to cover this and trying to tell Russian people the truth about what is going on in Ukraine. I mean, while the state media talks about Ukrainians shelling Ukrainians and these kind of absurd ideas about liberation, there are a few really strong independent media outlets in Russia who've been trying to tell the story, and they're now going to be shut down from doing that.
Now, having put you on the spot about Russia and Belarus, actually, did we get onto Belarus?
We didn't get onto Belarus, no.
I'm going to push you on Belarus.
Okay.
What is the significance of Belarus in all of this?
So Belarus is an interesting one because Alexander Lukashenko, the longtime dictator of Belarus, has tried to, over the years, play a kind of balancing act between the EU and the West and trying to get aid from both of them. Since 2010, he's kind of put a moratorium on executions and trying to appear kind of more friendly. But in 2020, there was popular uprising against his kind of very dictatorial rule. He put through thousands of Belarusians in prison. They were beaten. And this uprising was so popular that, in fact, he had to call on the Kremlin's support to quell it. And it seems now that in return for that support from the Kremlin, he's offered Belarus as a staging post to attack Ukraine.
Well, there's one here that's a little bit kind of tangential, but I think there's a serious point behind it, even though it's written in a slightly sort of inflammatory way, which is from Chris Scott, who says, Putin's face is swollen like a football, particularly compared to the pictures of 3 or 4 years ago. What is wrong? Is he taking steroids? Is there something going on there? He goes on in uncertain language about that might make him less rational, if you know what I mean, because the physical transformation of Putin is actually quite marked.
I mean, one can only speculate about his health condition. I mean, we've seen these absurdly long tables that he's had at meetings with foreign leaders, but also his own defence staff. It's just bizarre, these kind of 4-metre long tables between him and anyone else.
He's taking social distancing seriously.
He's taking social distancing very seriously, which maybe points at having an underlying health condition that makes him more concerned about coronavirus. But in terms of his mental health, it does mean that he's obviously increasingly isolated from people.
I think so. And again, just this is away from Ukraine, the country itself, but there is a question here from Ian Thompson about the West's reliance on Russian oil and gas, talking about, can Germany just restart some of the nuclear power plants that it's shut down, which has increased its reliance? Is there a way in which they can transform their own energy footprint so that there's not so much in Russia's hand when it's sitting at the table of international poker that's happening right now?
I think Germany does need to stop paying for Russian oil and gas. It's effectively paying for the war as long as it's doing so. And that's a huge problem. It's keeping the Russian economy just about its head above water. What are the options for Germany to do that? Obviously, it's said it's going to accelerate its push towards renewable energy. I'm not sure about the technicalities of restarting its power plants. I think they were quite aging nuclear power plants. I think they were aging beforehand, and they'd run a little bit past their sell-by date already. But it definitely needs to look very hard at how to kind of take very urgent measures to stop buying Russian oil and gas.
Well, in terms of our last question, it's one here from Sean. And it relates to the kind of wider impact here, because we heard at the start, before the invasion happened, that one of the things that Putin said would stay his hand was if Ukraine said it would never join NATO. It was very anti-NATO rhetoric that he had. And Sean's question is, should Finland and Sweden be rushing to draft legislation in order to join NATO? And interestingly today, we saw a poll that saw that support for that in Sweden's gone up markedly. It used to be, +5, it's now +24. It really is encouraging people to look at the defensive alliance.
Right. Well, I mean, Ukraine was a NATO country and was a neutral country in 2014 when Putin attacked then. It had aspirations to join NATO since 2008, but they were very unrealistic. And Putin knows that Ukraine couldn't join NATO as long as it had this territorial dispute with Crimea and the Donbass. So the NATO argument is perhaps not the reason here that he's doing what he's doing. And it's perhaps an excuse and a way to portray this as Russia versus the West instead of Russia just being greedy and taking Ukrainian lands. And I think, Finland and Sweden have a right to look at the situation, decide on their defensive alliances, and they're probably thinking this could happen to us. It happened to a neutral country before. Why shouldn't we be protected?
Well, you've talked about your wife, your wife's family. You've talked about the time that you lived there. How can you bear to see this on the television?
It's really difficult, yeah. And it's difficult to be tracking your friends and family as they move across the country and thinking about what their futures are and the hard work they've had. We had another friend who her family had spent years building up this house in Irpin, which is near Hostomel airfield, and it was completely destroyed. So all of that toil, all that effort, you can imagine putting savings into your house, and then it just wiped out in an instant, and you don't have a job, and you don't have a career, and you don't have a country. It's devastating to watch.
I hope one day you can go back there. I hope it's very soon.
Me too. Thank you.
Max Tucker, thank you so much. Thank you for all your brilliant questions. And if you want to read the fantastic Times journalism on Ukraine, you'll need a subscription. So just head to thetimes.co.uk and hit subscribe. Now, coming up after the news.